It's trust the fathers because, again, like I said earlier, they were genuinely enlightened by the Holy Spirit. They were holy men of God. They were saints. Like the fathers they weren't just writers of the church. They were actual saints of the church that left for us guideposts so that we don't get mixed up with all the confusion that's out there. Like by trusting the fathers, we save ourselves from falling into the trap of continuously every 4 years, every time a new war starts up. Oh, that's Gog and Magog, so we can save
Right.
ourselves that confusion, that mental anguish, from living on the edge about what Bible prophecy is going to be fulfilled next.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Body Aesthetic. My name is Matthew. Welcome to the Old T Mysteries podcast series. This is a new podcast series with myself and Dionysius here, who's our resident Old Testament expert. Dionysius has a YouTube channel called The Leap of Faith, which is dedicated to bridging the gap and making connections between the Old and New Testaments. Be sure to check it out. The objective of this podcast series, though, is to shine a light on some of the more esoteric and mysterious aspects of the Old Testament from specifically the Orthodox perspective. This is an evolving thing, so if you have any feedback on the series or some suggestions on topics, be sure to comment below. But without further ado, the topic today is two mysterious figures in the Old and New Testaments. And that is Gog and Magog. Dionysius here published a video of his research into the subject, and it's his most popular video on his channel with over 100,000 views. So I guess to kick us off here, Dionysius, my first question to you is, why do you think that video was so popular? Why do so many people care about identifying who Gog and Magog is? Why are they important? Why should we care?
Yeah, that's a good question, but I think it can be rooted. I think the answer to that question is rooted in both a political and a religious inquiry. And kind of what happens is with Gog and Magog, it's kind of like, like they say, like, mix politics with religion. Well, the subject of Gog and Magog is something that is mixed with politics and religion. It's almost like, even for example, and this is like recently I've been done this video, and like there's a lot of talk online about this subject. That's why it got a lot of views. But it even goes back probably thousands of years, honestly. But even recently, more recent times, or about 20 so years ago, when the Iraq War in 2003, the second
Mm-hmm.
Gulf War, it was when remember if you remember at the time, if people are old enough to remember, is that when the war started, it wasn't 100% popular in the international community. Americans were kind of more for it, it's post 9/11, everybody was psyched up. But I think it was France and I think Germany were kind of against it, in the UN or whatever. But what happened was, and you can Google this, is that George W. Bush had a conversation with the French president, Chirac at the time, and he said, George Bush is allegedly said that this war in Iraq was necessary to fight the sinister forces of Gog and Magog. So already, and if like a lot of evangelicals support war in the Middle East, and
Mm-hmm.
so and then again, a lot of Protestant evangelicals see these prophecies unfolding in modern times, and they want to associate them with things in the Bible, not just the New Testament, of course, like in Revelation, but they go back to Old Testament prophecies, specifically the end time battle of Gog and Magog that's listed in Ezekiel's chapter 38 and 39. And so
Mm.
that's why, so basically it's based on prophecy, a lot, and it's not just evangelical Protestants that are into this. Also, is Muslims are also interested in Gog and Magog, because Gog and Magog is also mentioned in the Quran. And just as the Bible talks about, it will be an epic battle, and like God is against Gog and all these kind of things. Like they're like kind of like they're like godless people. They're like antichrist, and so the Quran views them as the same way. And
Mm.
there's both. So you have both Christian inquiry and Islamic inquiry, and now even people in the political spectrum are getting sucked into this. Like George W. Bush, he was sucked into the whole Bible prophecy evangelical movement kind of thing, and so you kind of see that again today. And specifically, what you see, there's two wars that are hot right now. Of course, the war with Israel, America, and Iran, and then Russia, Ukraine. And Russia, Ukraine coming first, starting in, I think, 2022, is that a lot of people, again, Bible prophecy fanatics, were saying that the war between Russia and Ukraine was Gog and Magog. So they thought that that
Mm.
was prophecy being fulfilled, right? And then another, again, this is all from perspective and how you want to interpret the Bible. And there's all kinds of interpretations out there. I think you know that. And so basically, a lot of times people can kind of read into the Bible certain events that may or may not actually be the fulfillment of prophecy. But regardless if it is a fulfillment or not, the fact remains, and to answer your question why, is that this is a peak interest of people, specifically the evangelicals that want to see Bible prophecy being fulfilled, especially in the modern times, and they think this is going to be the ushering in of the rapture and all these kind of things, so they're kind of like giddy about
Mm-hmm.
these kind of things, so it gets a lot of interest. And again, it's not just evangelicals, the Muslims are interested too, because just like Christians believe in Armageddon, and I think Jewish tradition says the same, but in Islam they have a thing called the Malhama, and that's like the Muslim version of or their understanding of what the Armageddon will be, this epic end time battle between the forces of good and evil. And the Orthodox understanding of Gog and Magog is that it doesn't necessarily mean, just because even in the New Testament and Revelation, it talks about Gog and Magog. And the Orthodox understanding is it's not just two specific nations, but rather a conglomerate of nations that are antichrist in nature or fierce in this battle or will participate in the end time battle. And so it's not just, so the Orthodox understanding is it's not, when it mentions Gog and Magog in Revelation, that this end time battle, it's not just two nations, but rather um, all nations that would be against God in the end.
Mm.
Yeah, that would participate in it. Yeah, so that's a clear. It needs to have. It's important to get that clear understanding, and that's what Orthodoxy does. Orthodoxy pretty much smooths out everything, smooths out the playing field, and it gets it's easy. It's a safer route to go by, And as we say in Orthodoxy, we trust the fathers, because these were genuinely holy men that that were vessels of the Holy Spirit, and they were enlightened, and they were able to guide us, so that we don't be like other religious groups out there that see, like, oh, there was a blood moon last night. That's the fulfillment of all the prophecies, And so, I mean, when something like, like some event might happen that they think, like, for example, like when the war with Iran started, when it was before the America Israel hit them back in February, I think it was last year when it was the war was just when it was missiles between Iran and Israel were going off. I think they called it the 12-day war, 11-day war, something like that. A lot of evangelicals were, I mean, I saw them, they were talking about that this was what Iran was doing was the fulfillment of Gog and Magog.
Mm.
And the evangelicals were looking at Iran as Gog and Russia as Magog. But they're not, it's not consistent, because even before that, when it was Russia, Ukraine, they thought that was Gog and Magog, So it's like it
Have you
changes.
seen
It's
that
just like,
Spider-Man
huh?
meme where it's like, have you seen that meme where it's like three Spider-Mans like pointing at each
No,
other, and
no.
it's like they all look the same, so they're like, you're Gog, you're Magog, you're
Oh,
no,
yeah.
you're Gog.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen that meme, but putting the mental picture together, that pretty much explains it. And so it just shows you that we're not the only ones coming to that conclusion about all this madness that's out there. Uh,
Well,
you
so
know,
what I'm
huh?
understanding is that there's kind of two camps to it, or uh, n- at minimum. So there's people that are trying to identify Gog and Magog as a means to, let's say, guesstimate the eschaton or whatever. Like, oh, the apocalypse is coming because Russia invaded Ukraine, and or, uh, Iran, the war with Iran, and all that. Um, but at the same time, there's world leaders that try to manipulate people and the common man to justify whatever they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah,
just like George Bush
yeah.
invading Iraq and saying, oh, we ought to fight Gog and Magog, obviously, right? Um, so it sounds like there's, that's why there's such a high charge associated with who these
Exactly.
two figures are or
Right.
identities are, we could say.
Right. And I think that's what gets, and then that's what gets people interested is that, and then they start to go back to the Bible and then they go to history. And that's what I've done. And that's what inspired me, to make the video that I made called Identifying Gog and Magog, to kind of, and coming from an Orthodox Christian perspective, to kind of like iron out all the details. And also it was an exercise for me to look into it myself and to find what I could find. And I went through both the biblical, the Orthodox interpretation of the Bible, Islamic sources, and then into the historical record, like Josephus, like the Jewish historian, the first century AD, Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He wrote about Gog and Magog, and he called them. He said that the Greeks identified them as the Scythians, right?
Mm,
Now,
mhm,
in history, the Scythians. There's some debate about their ethnicity. Some say that they were kind of like a Persian tribe, but then
mm,
others kind of associate them as like a semi-nomadic Persian tribe. But then some more people try to. Other sources say that they came from Western Siberia and then eventually settled in southern Russia, and that would make them more Russian in origin rather than Iran Persian. You know.
mm,
And I tend to agree with that. I've seen both arguments for both cases, and with the research that I've done, I think the Scythians can be identified as more of a Russian or more of a Japhetic bloodline. You know, when you talk about the Table of Nations of Genesis chapter 10, when you have the descendants of Japheth and the descendants of Shem and Ham, and you know, Japheth was like the father of like the Europeans and the Russians, the Slavs, the white people, and then you have Shem being the father of not just the Jews but the Arabs, and I think even it's interesting because there's a son of Shem, and to be a Semite, that's what we want to get that out of the way. The term Semitic comes from Shem, which was one of the three sons of Noah, and Shem was the ancestor of Abraham, who was the father of the Israelites, the Jew, who became known to be the Jews later on, and also he's the father of the Arabs through Ishmael. You know,
mm,
so Ishmael Arabs are Semitic peoples as well. So it's to be a Semite doesn't necessarily mean just to be a Jew, but a Semite is somebody who's a descendant of Shem, right?
right.
And Arabs, being descendants of Shem, are Semitic. And
Mhm,
so there's other, and I've looked into this. Uh, Elam is the Elamites, and that's historically that's a name in the Bible. Elamites, where Elam was a son of Shem, and it's believed that the Elamites were the ancestors of the Persians, right?
mm,
And I think there's also a son of Shem called Aram, and that's where you get the word Aramaic. You know,
mm.
so that's
Oh,
yeah, exactly
I didn't
right,
know that.
right, right. Right.
That's
So these
cool.
are all. So that's what we got to realize is that the Middle East. It's kind of funny. It's like if you live in the Middle East and you just how can just one person be Semitic? How can one just
Mhm,
people group be Semitic? No, they're all Semitic. They're all kind of like brothers in a way, like are mixed in. You know what I mean? Like they're different. They have that shared ancestry, you know. And it's
mm,
interesting, like just like there's 12 tribes of Israel. It also in Genesis it talks about that there were 12 princes of Ishmael. God said, "I will make him into a great nation, and 12 princes shall descend from him." So I even made a video about that, so you can check that out on Leap of Faith, the 12 Princes of Ishmael, and I break that down and how all that worked out. So yeah, there's a lot of confusion about going back to Gog and Magog. There's a lot of confusion about identifying them as individual people, but from what I've seen is like the Scythians could have been, and even Josephus says that they were called the Magagites, but the Greeks called them the Scythians, and looking into it. And as far as the geographical region that they settled in was the area between the Black and Caspian seas, right above the Caucasus Mountain range. So
mhm,
that's perfect. That's where we see the fighting going on between the conflict between Russia and Ukraine right now is that same exact area. And I think because other people
mm,
realize that from being historians and looking into these things, and then they can kind of put two and two together. Well, maybe this is the Gog and Magog battle unfolding before
mhm,
us. You know, so so I wouldn't say so I wouldn't say that people are going out on a limb to believe these things. they have a point. You know, people do have a point. When I know I shouldn't make fun of people that you know, just try to interpret prophecy, but they have some. I think most people that study the Bible and do these things, you know, for their credit, they do have a I think their heart's in the right place, but I think the main
Hmm.
thing is getting our mind in the right place and focusing on what's the most plausible outcome. But again, when studying Bible prophecy, even just regular things in the Bible, even reading the Gospels, there's a lot of mysteries that we don't really grasp 100% with our mind. And that's just it. The Bible's a spiritual book, and the spirituality can't fully be understood through the intellect. It has to be understood through the heart, through our own spirit where we meet where it's there in the heart that the fathers say that we meet Christ. That's where we meet God within. And it's through the heart that we understand we experience the grace of God and the knowledge of God and these kind of things. Right.
Yeah, and it's like just as a sidebar, just like the Ethiopian in scripture was reading,
Mm,
the scriptures, and
right.
uh, he was asked like, "Do you understand what you're reading?" He's like, "How can I unless someone teaches me?" Right. And so we get the teaching from the fathers, right? That's
Right.
why we
Exactly.
our
Trust the
objective as
fathers.
Orthodox is to know what the fathers wrote and
Right.
talked about. And
Right. And
well, so
having
let's
and
go. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but let's go all the way back to like the beginning. Like, take us back to the first mention of Gog and Magog in the Old Testament, and then kind of walk us through the biblical history of where these figures or nations or whatever they are keep appearing again in biblical history, and then tie us that to what we know outside of biblical history, I guess, in a
okay.
secular historical context.
Sure. Okay, well, I guess so again, first of all, the first mention of Magog is in Genesis chapter 10 verse 2 where it mentions that's Genesis chapter 10 is the table of nations. Basically, that's when that's like listing all the tribes, all the like the how when the word after the flood, when the earth was repopulated, it brings out the nations, the you know the three sons of Noah and all their descendants, and that's what you call the table of nations. And Magog is listed as a direct son. I think it's the second son of Japheth, and also with him is mentioned Meshach and Tubal. Now in Ezekiel chapter 38, you talk about God says, "I will set my face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal." Now, even though Gog isn't mentioned as a son of Japheth in Genesis chapter 10, but Magog is. And then when they see that in Ezekiel, that they some people say that it says that Gog of the land of Magog, so it can't so Gog can't be in that nation part of Magog. But I know some people make that argument. But in the New Testament, in the Revelation, it does say Gog and Magog. And not only that, but like further down in uh in Ezekiel, it does say that I will send. God says in that same 38 chapters 30 and 39, God says I will send fire upon Magog. So right there, so if you keep reading, you do see that Magog is included within the battle of Gog and Magog. So it's not Gog. Some people make that argument that say when it says in some Bible translation, the King James, it doesn't say that. It's just I will set my face against Gog, the land of Magog. But in the New King James, it says I will set my face against Gog of the land of Magog. So that's led some people to believe that the land was named Magog, but the people living on that land were Gog. But
Mm.
that kind of goes into like we're kind of like splitting hairs at that point, you know. But a lot of that's what you find a lot in these Bible prophecy forums. There's a lot of hair splitting.
I bet.
But basically, yeah, oh yeah. See, you should see. I think I have like 1,000 comments, and you should see all what they say.
Yeah.
You know, I can't respond to all of them honestly, but anyway, I just
Well,
kind of let
so
it go. Huh?
is it 100% sure that every time Gog and Magog is mentioned, it's referring to the same people or same person?
It would seem again. It seems like in the Old Testament, because that those descendants of Japheth are mentioned, basically Meshach and Tubal are included within. It seems like again, it seems like the Bible, even though Gog and Magog are the prominent players, it's like the main thing. It's like there's other nations involved. Even Ezekiel says that Meshach and Tubal, exactly, or for example, you know, they're also included, and that would coincide with what the fathers of the church say is that it's many nations. It's not just two specific nations. But as far as this the historical goes, and you could link that to the Old Testament, is that that Gog and Magog could represent the Russians, or Magog could be represent the land of Russia, and Gog possibly Ukraine maybe, or that area between the Black and Caspian Sea, right above the Caucasus Mountains. That seems like that was the ancient place where the Scythians uh, settled.
Mm,
I think going all the way back to, I think the Scythian Empire was founded around the 8th century BC, right? So from ancient times, they were there, at least from, by the time Josephus came around, this was 8 centuries into it. So he already knew that they had settled there, and he saw some called them the Magagites, but the Greeks called them the Scythians. And it's believed that they came from, like I said before, they came from Western Siberia and then settled in that area. So if Gog or Magog could be identified as a real historical ethnic group, whatever you want to say, or a nation, it's looking more like it that it could be uh, not necessarily the Russians, but a people that lived in that same area where in between Russia and Ukraine.
mm,
Like how migrations and things change over time. So it's really hard to pinpoint again because we live in modern times. This is like over 2,000 years after the fact. And, migrations change and different settlements happen. And so it's difficult to pinpoint Gog and Magog historically as one specific or two specific nations that we can relate to in modern times. You understand? But historically, the Scythians are what is believed to be Magog, and that's traditionally uh, Russia. And I think there's a lot of historians, a lot of prophecy scholars out there that come to that same conclusion. And there's even been some speculation that Gog is actually China.
mm,
That's come up before too. That I'm not too sure about, but again, there's a lot of mysteries out there, and that's why we call this Old Testament mysteries. Is because we have some things that we do know, and then many things that we don't know. So a lot of Bible study, a lot of Bible historical research or prophecy, whatever you want to call it, a lot of it is informed guesswork. So that's why when I study the Bible, I don't just study the Bible, I study history as well, like the historical record, like the ancient records, all the way up in even more modern times. We'll talk about some Christian sources, the post in the AD era that talk about Gog and Magog, and not just the Bible or not just ancient history or Josephus, the first century historian, Jewish historian. But there's actually some Christian literature from about maybe the 3rd or 4th century AD, and then some from about the 13th century AD that mention that speak about Gog and Magog.
mm.
So it's yeah,
Well,
and
before we
again,
get to that part
sure,
of
okay,
history, when we talked about this before, you mentioned the Caucasian Gates
yes.
built by Alexander the Great.
Well,
And
that's a legend.
well, tell us about that legend because that was meant to keep out Gog and
Yes,
Magog, right, from
yes, that was a
civilization.
legend. That was a legendary barrier. There's two traditions. Like again, like the legend has it that Alexander the Great built this, and he was around the third late early 4th century, late 4th century AD. I mean BC. Late 4th century BC, around 330 or so. That's around Alexander's time and BC. And he built. The legend has it is that God, like in ancient times, Gog and Magog were known as these like barbarian, unruly people, and godless, and they were like very powerful. And that the legend has it is that Alexander the Great built this barrier to contain Gog and Magog. And that barrier, like you said, you mentioned the Caucasian Gates. I'm talking about that area between the Black and Caspian Sea, just north of Russia. Well, that area between the Black and Caspian Sea that separates Georgia from the south to Russia to the north is known as the Caucasus Mountain Range, right?
Mhm,
And there's only one pass that goes through those mountains, and that's what they call today as the Darial Gorge. But in ancient times, it was called the Caspian Gates or the Caucasian Gates, and that was an ancient trade route that people used to go through.
hmm,
And they believed that was since Gog and Magog were traditionally believed to be uh, to hail from north of the Caucasus in that area between the Black and Caspian Seas, and you know that areas that's where they needed a barrier to be built to shut them out. and some legends say that it was Alexander the Great. That's like the historical legend. And then the Quran has a story about that as well, but they don't say it's Alexander the Great. They say it's a character called Zulkarnain, and that and the Quran says that he took blocks of iron and built this wall, and then sealed this iron gate with molten copper to seal the gate to contain Gog and Magog. And then the Quran goes on to say that at one time he said in the future, I think it was Muhammad prophesied that in the future there'll be uh, a weakness in the gate or a hole or something, and eventually the gate will come down and Gog and Magog will be released into the world.
Hmm.
And there's other, and again, like there's other ways to there's again, this is a now we go into Islamic scholarship and Islamic interpretation of their scriptures. And some people say that some Islamic scholars say that this what the Quran says, that Gog and Magog being released, is that it's not so much, again, this is like if you could look at it allegorically, it's not so much that it's individual. It's two types of people, like two nations that come into the world and just wreak havoc, but it's a mentality. Just like the fathers of the church say that Gog and Magog represents a conglomerate of people that are of the same mind. And that's the same thing with the Islam. Islam is saying, the Islamic scholars are saying that Gog and Magog represent godless Western
Hmm.
secular civilization, and that this it's become with globalism and this new world uh, way of thinking, the secular way of thinking, godless, where the people don't care about religion. They just want to hear, they just want to eat, drink, and be merry. They want to embrace this new world that we have, and they want to reject traditional religion, traditional values. And so
Well, a
that
world where
is
everything is permitted, right? Like I
exactly.
can be
And
anyone, do anything, and
do whatever you,
any kind of impingement. Do as thou wilt, right? The satanic,
as shall be the whole of
mantra,
the law.
right?
But yeah, but basically, and that's what the Islamic scholars are saying. What represents when the Quran says that Gog and Magog will eventually be released, is that this, and throughout the whole world, is that this mentality, this spiritual decadence, or like you said, this flesh, this life that's just their only thing is they're not worried about spirituality. It's just all about the flesh. And
Hmm.
it's all, and that's been a global thing that's been embraced. Like more and more traditional religions are being rejected, and the new world, the new way of thinking, this new globalist agenda is being accepted globally. And so that's how they say, that's how the Islamic scholars say that Gog and Magog will be released into the world
Yeah.
through, it will be more of a spiritual thing rather than a military uh conflict.
Well, I think it's very fascinating, and I kind of want to go down a little side tangent before we get into the Christian sources that you're talking about that refer to Gog and Magog. But we talked about patterns, right? Patterns of people, and there's a common pattern in history across cultures of the barbarian, right? And there's this pattern of like kind of the foreigner and the barbarian are kind of tied
Mm,
together. So like we think of barbarian as just
yeah.
like totally uncivilized, but I don't know, wearing a loincloth in the woods. But that's not necessarily what a barbarian is. Because even what we consider like classically barbarian cultures, like let's say European pagan cultures, they had lots of rules and laws and things that shaped their society. That were they weren't just like chaotic like Neanderthals. But the barbarian is kind of like a representation of chaos and instability because um, it's like the separation of civilization and then non-civilization. So like the Garden of Eden was like a walled garden where nature is essentially tamed and controlled, so to speak, and then outside is the wild and the thorns and um, even in biblical imagery, like the wild is associated with like demonic spirits and like when Jesus was tempted, he was in the
And it's the
wilds,
wilderness,
right? The
right?
wilderness, like
Right.
it's kind of interesting. But the point I
like
wanted
a
to make
barren
about,
wasteland kind of thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
and even so like you know that chant that we have, I don't know if it's when we do it for triumph of orthodoxy, but we say, "O Lord, save thy people and bless thine inheritance, preserve thy community by thy cross." Uh, wow, I'm forgetting it, but uh, granting to thy people victory over all adversaries. In the Arabic, which I can't give you the whole Arabic spiel, but instead of adversaries in Arabic, we say barbar, which is barbarian. So
right.
it's like, Lord, grant us victory over the barbarians.
Barbarians, right. And
So
that
like,
and that
go ahead.
go ahead.
I just wanted to say barbarian is like that pattern of people that represent essentially like chaos that'll unwind, civilization. It's the foreigner, it's the invader. And so Gog and Magog kind of sounds like it, it, it's that pattern, right? Repeating
Yes.
itself.
I think it's a typology that comes across again. And when they say that that barbarian or that and that it lead us from all adversaries, and sometimes some translators say lead us against all adversaries, both fleshly and bodiless.
Mm,
So the adversary, so we're looking like you mentioned before, like the wilderness being or associated with demonic or whatever, and that's where Jesus was tempted by the devil. So outside of the camp of God, outside of the Garden of Eden, is the barbarian, the Scythian, the demonic realm or something like that, where you have the enemies of God. Those enemies of God are both fleshly, body like humans, and demonic. So that's why we say that all enemies is both fleshly and bodiless. And there's that, and that goes again. That I think that coincides with the Father's teaching of Gog and Magog, not necessarily being representing two nations of the flesh, but rather a spirituality or a mindset for
mhm.
those all all nations that are aligned with more demonic forces rather than those of Christ.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And is that what they say in the Christian sources that you? Uh,
In the Christian sources, well, this is interesting because in the Christian sources, I think there was a bishop, Methodius, not to be mistaken with there's two Methodius, but this was Bishop Methodius of Patera, and he was around the third or fourth century, and he wrote about Gog and Magog, and he said that they were of the confines of the east. Now he was living in Athens, and I think he lived in Lebanon at some point, and so to the east, that's like further, east of the Middle East, so that's kind of going into Asia in that area. So that could have been encompassing that area that that the Scythians lived or that Gog and Magog hailed from. And he talked about Gog and Magog, and he said that not only were they a warlike people, a godless people, they even had a hideous appearance. That they were
mm,
primitive, they were backwards, they were just like the most ignorant. They said I think his exact words. They were as ignorant as animals. Okay, so that's how he describes. So even Gog and Magog are even mentioned, even in the Christian era. After the Bible's written, this is past post Old Testament times. This is after centuries after Ezekiel, and so even in the Orthodox Christian writings, the Gog and Magog is mentioned. Now it's interesting that Methodius, the bishop Saint Methodius, who I think was even a martyred actually, he's a martyr of the church. He wrote about this, and this was around like the third, fourth century AD. This is a couple centuries before Islam, right? Now it's interesting that he says that he's describing Gog and Magog as being having a hideous appearance, and they were ignorant animals because there's some Islamic sources that say that Gog and Magog where like they describe them as like funny looking creatures that live under the earth, and they have like they're like disfigured and all kinds of stuff. That's one, and but there's not all Islamic scholars agree with that interpretation, but some Muslims, some schools of thought in Islam believe that. And so it makes me wonder if they were piggybacking off of that Christian tradition, just like you have stories in the old in the Quran of they're basically retelling of stories of the Old and the New Testament, and there's some basis to believe that Muhammad may have been influenced by a heretical Christian bishop or a monk that was kind of feeding him these stories. So
Mm.
so that seems like the fact that there's a tradition in Orthodox Christianity concerning Gog and Magog that kind of similar to Islamic understanding of who they are, and that also that's what the early Christians says, is that they were they described them as this primitive, this backwards kind of people,
Yeah, and
and you
it
see that,
like a person like Jonathan Pageau, with his symbolism, I guess you could say, like when we're talking about the garden and the wild, it's like the extent with which you move away from the garden and go into the wild, the more bestial and animalistic and barbaric you become, right?
and that's interesting that
Um,
you say that because when Cain, after he killed his brother Abel, the Bible says that he went to the east of Eden,
mm,
that he went even further away. He drifted even farther from God, and not only that they were already banished from Eden, but then after Cain committed his crime, it says that he moved even further away from Eden, to the east of Eden, into the land of Nod, so he was drifting further away from God.
right.
Yeah, right.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. So about the Scythian thing, I think it's interesting because are you familiar with Saint Mercurius?
Yeah, St. Macarius, yeah.
Not Macarius the Great, Saint
Okay,
Mercurius,
Mercurius.
known
I'm
as
not too
Abu
familiar.
Sayfan.
No.
So he was actually a Scythian. So before you start being like, ah, you're Russian, you're Gog,
Right.
um, I think it does go back to the fact that Gog and Magog is a pattern, a spiritual pattern, because Saint Mercurius, and I'll just go into the story a little bit because he's one of my favorite saints, and anyone who's Orthodox should know who he is. Um, he was a Roman soldier that was an exceptional Roman soldier um, that was promoted to essentially general, and he was a Christian, and he was fighting barbarians, right? Civilization versus a barbarian, and an angel of the Lord came down to him and gave him a sword from heaven and basically said that, like, with the sword you will be victorious over your enemies. Just remember after your victory, like, don't forget what the Lord has done for you. And so with his sword from heaven and his own military sword, they call him Abu Saifan, which is father of the sword. Um, he you know laid waste to the barbarians and was totally victorious. And so the Roman leadership rewarded him lavishly. And then essentially, long story short, when he was pushed to basically make sacrifices to the pagans, he refused. And then the angel of the Lord visited him again and was like, remember what I told you. Don't forget, what the Lord has done for you. And so he endured martyrdom due to that. And he was a Scythian. So yeah, so going back to Gog and Magog as being like a specific culture, um, I definitely think, because of obviously the fathers of the church and what they say, but also just as an example of Saint Mercurius, is that it's not necessarily specific to an ethnicity. It's like
Right.
as a pattern of behavior. It's a spiritual
Exactly.
pattern
Right.
of being just godless and
Right.
essentially an enemy of God, right?
Exactly.
Because
Right.
God sets himself against Gog
Against
and
against
Magog.
Gog, right. And
Right.
he sets a fire upon Magog. He said, I will set my face against Gog, and I will set fire upon Magog. So, and that fire that you said that God talks about, I will set fire upon Magog and he is destroyed. Well, you see that in the Revelation when it talks about the armies of Gog and Magog. It says that fire came down from heaven from God and destroyed them and devoured them.
Mm,
You know, right? This is so that's what leads me to believe that the Ezekiel, the mention of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel and in Revelation are the same, are one and the same, and not two separate events.
mm.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
people are kind of spinning their wheels trying to figure out who Gog and Magog is.
I know. And it's kind of interesting. Okay, just like we talked about, first they were saying Gog and Magog was Russia, Ukraine, and then they were saying it was Iran. Now it's Iran and Russia, but yet and now Iran, they're looking in, they're studying their books and they're saying, well, Gog and Magog is America and Israel. So it depends again from whatever perspective, from whatever viewpoint you're coming from. You could read into these prophecies pretty much anything.
Yeah,
That's
anytime my
why
neighbor throws trash on my side of the lawn, then he's Gog. They're Gog and Magog.
Magog, I'll set my face against you. It's like get off my. It's like is that you could say, or like we could just joke and say, yeah, like those unruly neighbors down the street. Yeah, that's Gog and Magog. you know.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So let's go to Revelation. What is
sure.
yeah, tell us about Gog and Magog in the context of
Okay.
the book of Revelation.
Right. It's only basically one verse or a couple verses in Revelation chapter 20, where it talks about we'll set again. He talks about I will send. It talks about nations coming from the four corners of the earth. Not just one geographical area or two geographical areas that are close to one another, but nations from the four corners of the earth. So this is nations from all over the world coming together to descending upon the Holy Land or Israel for this end time battle, and uh, that that basically God fire from heaven comes down and devours them.
Mm.
Right. So that's in Revelation. And it says, and that's at the end of time. It is mentioned when it talks about, we talk about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and that can be looked at upon where it's not an exact 1,000 years, but really the time between the first and second coming of Jesus Christ. That's the
Mm.
Orthodox understanding of the millennial reign. That it's not a literal 1,000 years, but rather to be looked at as like ruling and reigning with Christ. We're Christians. We have Christ ruling and reigning within us. So that time between Christ's first and second coming is that millennial reign. And it was after the millennial reign, after those 1,000 years, when Satan is loosed from his prison to go to deceive the nations, which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, that they come against the Holy Land, and that's when God comes down and destroys them.
Yeah, the number of whom
Hmm.
is the sand of the sea.
Sand of the sea, exactly right.
Yeah.
And you see, and in Ezekiel, it talks about how because of the same thing, you see how he talks about how God says, "I'll set fire upon Magog," and that when God also says in Ezekiel that he goes, "I will make a grave. I will make graves for Magog. I'm going to make graves for Gog, and he shall be buried on the east of the sea." And then when it says east of the sea, that's known as the Dead Sea. In that
Mm-hmm.
area, and that they will be, and that will be, and there they will bury Gog, who's and they will call it the Valley of Haman Gog, and the Bible says it will take them 7 months to bury the dead. That'll be that many casualties, that amount of carnage, that amount of you know corpses. That'll be so epic in number that it'll take a little 7 months to bury them all, and they'll bury them to the east of the Dead Sea. It says in the Bible, it doesn't say the Dead Sea, but when it says the east of the sea, traditionally we believe that that's talking
Mm.
is referring to the Dead Sea. And it's interesting that graveyard for Gog, known as the Valley of Haman Gog, is in that valley of the valley of the Dead Sea. That Rift Valley there, and that it's just as fire comes down to destroy them from God destroys them with fire, and they're buried near the Dead Sea. Well, that's the same place where Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by fire coming down from heaven. Yeah.
Yeah, that
So
pattern
it's
repeating again.
exactly like you talked about earlier, like patterns repeating themselves, and you see that a lot. And even some people say, and I don't like to go too much into the interpretation of Revelation too deeply because of the dangers involved. But one thing, a father from Greece, a contemporary father, he was a teacher of the church, Father Athanasios Methylanios, who were opposed in 2006, I believe. He did a lot of he did a lot of work on he did historical and the church fathers. He did a lot of work and research on interpreting Revelation from an Orthodox standpoint. And when Revelation talks about how the seven seals are Christ loosens the seven seals. Well, the understanding, just like you said, patterns repeating themselves. Father Athanasios even said that the loosening of the seals, the seven seals, happen in cycles, and that when a seal is broken or unsealed, that the train of events, they work themselves out until come back to center, so back to square one, and then they're resealed again. And then
Mm.
other points, and then other events in history happen that break the seal, and then again the series of events unfold until they work themselves out, and then it comes back again. And that's what you call the cyclical theory. That's a theory of that verse in Revelation where it talks of the loosing of the seven seals. Right.
Well, it
And
makes
so that would
sense
seem.
because,
Uh-huh.
obviously history is cyclical,
Mm,
because
right.
as humans, I like to say history is humans being humans, and we repeat the same patterns over and over. We tend to make the same mistakes over and over, even just personally within your own life. You can see
Exactly. I was
that,
going to say
right?
myself. I made myself the
Yeah.
same mistakes over and over again.
Right. So it's like history is that translated on the macro scale, and the Bible is a medical. It's a meta text. It's a spiritual text. So it points to the pattern that we experience. And so, like, like the apocalypse and the events approaching the apocalypse, like that, there is a specific point in time where that's going to happen. But at the same time, there's like many eschatons that happen cyclically, in
That's
pretty
true.
much every age throughout
Right.
history.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess you could kind of say it's almost like cycles of death and rebirth, right? Which is a
It's a
common,
common
one of the
theme.
most,
Common
yeah,
theme
one of the most
in
fundamental
Christian
cycles of
and
reality, right?
right.
So,
Well, even the Crusades, like when the Crusades happened, when they first started, when the Europeans, were hell bent on retaking the Holy Land from the Muslims. It happened around the year. It was, I think, in 1096 is when they were officially kicked off. But remember, this was 1096, so it was getting close to the year 1099, and people thought that, yeah, right, exactly. So people were thinking that because all this was
Y2K. No,
happening,
I'm just kidding.
exactly, it was like the Y2, it was like Y2K 1.0. No, back in the medieval times, is that the people back in those times thought that because we're getting close to this new century in the millennium, this 1099, and the Muslim, they're destroying the holy places, and they literally thought that Armageddon was coming, and that was a part of the motivating factor for the Crusades to motivate these people to fight the Christians or the Catholics or whatever, the Western Christians to fight in the Holy Land is they literally thought back in those days that the end of the world was at hand
Yeah.
because again of the geopolitical landscape. Just like we talked about how even some believers try to tie geopolitical battles with Bible prophecy in modern times. Well, they were doing it back 1,000 years ago. They were doing the same thing, right?
Hmm.
So that cycle,
Another
like you said,
pattern.
humans being humans, it's the same thing over and over again. I'm even old enough to see like the younger generation, and I see them, and I remember myself when I was that age. And it's kind of funny because like when we were coming up, I'm Gen X, Generation X, and people, the older generation, that's what we didn't call ourselves Generation X. They branded us that because they thought we were like off brand, and like we were like it kind of took like back in like the 50s or so they would have a commercial. They said, oh, they would have like the name brand, and then they said, oh, but don't trust brand X, you know. So this
Mm.
brand X, that's so we were labeled as brand X, like like kind of like the refuse, like these kids are no good, and now I see the same thing with even my generation, Gen X's. We have that same tendency to look at the younger generation and Gen Zers and to kind of criticize them and everything. And some people have come up to me, my age group, and I've kind of been guilty of it too a little bit. But they said, man, these millennials or these Gen Zers or whatever. I said, man, come on, look, we're Generation X. They said the same thing about us when we were their age. So that pattern, I even see these same patterns happening in within the past 20 years. So just think of what's happened in the past 2,000 years.
Hmm.
All the same, how people have thought. I think even some Christian saints. I think Saint John Chrysostom even in his day he was thinking that the end of time was coming soon, and that
Mm.
was like in the fourth century, fifth century. Yeah,
Yeah, these no good youths bringing about the
yeah,
end of the world.
It's like every generation's another Gog and Magog, you know. It's like
Yeah.
it
Well,
just gets
even
recycled, you know.
even in BC
Uh,
times, like I don't know if
right.
it was Aristotle or whatever, one of those ancient Greek
Plato.
philosophers. It was
Yeah,
Plato. Okay,
it was
yeah,
Plato. Yeah, he said, oh, this younger generation, there's no hope for the future and everything.
yeah.
And that's so funny because he's supposed to be this wisest, smartest
Above it
man of
all,
his day. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I know. And it's like he was saying the same thing that he was. I mean, that just shows you that even Plato, he was history repeating himself, even though he was like this brilliant thinker. Like he
yeah.
came up with these quote unquote new ideas, these novel ideas, but yet he was even guilty himself of the common thing that all humans fall into, you know.
Plato was a
So that
boomer.
and Aristotle was Gen X.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Well, any closing thoughts you have about this topic? Maybe something that you covered in the video, or maybe like in your research for your Gog and Magog video that you discovered, and maybe want to maybe you learned something new since you published that video. And
Well, the main thing that I learned new from publishing the video from when I first posted about almost 2 years ago was that in the video I think that I tried to say that the Gog Magog battle spoken of in Ezekiel and the one mentioned in Revelation were two separate events. I think I said that in the video, but since then, since further research, I've come to the conclusion that it's not two separate events, but it's one and the same, but from two perspectives. You
hmm,
know. But I do think that the Gog and Magog battle mentioned in Ezekiel and the one in Revelation is talking about the same end time battle, you know. Right.
gotcha.
That's that. Yeah. So that's one thing I've learned since then. And other closing thoughts. Now remember, as far as going on to like as far as to identifying them as a nation or two nations, and not just as a symbolic representation of all godless powers in the world, you know, or antichrist mentalities out there, is that some people have believed that the Khazars, right? These were like a group of people that lived in between. They were a Turkic tribe that lived again. They lived in that area between the Black and Caspian Seas, and their empire was started around the 7th century AD, around the same place where the ancient Scythians settled. And of course, the
Hmm.
Scythians were defeated and they moved on and everything. And again, how we talked about earlier about how migrations and empires rise and fall and different ethnic groups kind of move in and kind of build some civilizations are built upon other previous civilizations, you know. And that's kind of the same thing with the Khazars. It's what's interesting about them is that they lived in that area between the Black and Caspian Seas. And in Solomon, Bishop, not King Solomon, but this was a Christian bishop of Basra. I think he was an historian. He was like an Assyrian bishop or an historian that lived in Iraq. You know, so there's like a lot of Syriac kind of influence there, that ancient kind of Christianity that's not we're not they're not Orthodox, they're not in communion with us, but they're
Yeah,
still
Church of the East.
exactly. And he wrote about that and included he wrote in his around the 13th century AD is that he wrote that among the nations of Gog and Magog, Ashkenaz was also included among them. Just as we said
Hmm.
before that Meshech and Tubal were mentioned as brothers of Magog in the Genesis table of nations, well, Ashkenaz was also a descendant of Japheth. So he would be included among. So the Bishop of Solomon, Bishop of Basra, included Ashkenaz as among the nations of Gog and Magog. Now, what's interesting about the word Ashkenaz is that the Jews living in Israel today are typically classified as Ashkenazi Jews, right? And the Khazars living in that area, in that same area where traditionally believed that the actual nations of Gog and Magog hailed from, is that in the around the 8th century, 7th or 8th century AD, they eventually mass converted to Judaism. They weren't ethnic Jews. They weren't of the tribe of Judah, but they converted to Judaism, the religion, and then about the 10th century AD, they were defeated by the Russians, you know, the Kievan Rus at that time, and they migrated after they were defeated. Again, how migrations happen, you know, empires rise and fall, and after their nation fell, they migrated into Eastern Europe and they settled there. and then that's where I think they took the term. And Ashkenaz being a descendant of Japheth, Europeans being the traditional descendants of Japheth, and so they took the name Ashkenaz and
Mm.
called themselves Ashkenazi Jews, and that's the origin of that. And so that's how, and so it's interesting. So some people have, I don't really personally believe this, but some, again, how, depending on your perspective, how, from a Protestant evangelical, Jewish perspective, Gog and Magog may be looked upon as Iran and Russia. Well, from an Islamic or a more Eastern view, Gog and Magog could be represented as Israel,
Mm-hmm.
depending on your perspective. And so that's where they have that tradition that comes from, that some people equate the Khazars with the Ashkenazi Jews, and then and since there's a connection between Ashkenaz and Gog and Magog from ancient sources, that the Ashkenazi Jews could be
Yeah.
seen as the
So
nations of Gog and Magog.
it
I
goes
know.
back to Gog and Magog is everyone I don't like.
Exactly. If like in the ancient times, like we say, like don't be a nerd, like you're in school, like hey, look at that nerd over there, like back in the BC times, like man, look at Gog and Magog over there sitting under the tree. You don't want to be like those losers,
Those hooligans.
those those Gen Xers.
I love it. Well, this has been a really
Yeah,
fascinating
yeah,
discussion, fascinating topic. I'm really excited for this series because, like I told you, Dionysius, me personally, I'm not as well read of the Old Testament as I should be. And this is a good chance for me and, by extension, the audience to, learn about the Orthodox perspective on some of the stuff that you just, you may read one time and just be like, I don't really get that. So I'm just going to ignore it. But I'm really respect your work with the leap of faith in connecting the Old and New Testaments. And hopefully with this podcast series, we can help people increase their understanding of scripture,
God willing. Yeah.
God willing. I guess I maybe should have made a disclaimer that, like, run everything by your priest. But
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
everything we say here is,
Well, we said before, trust the fathers. That's the main thing.
right. Right.
Is trust the fathers, because again, like I said earlier, they were genuinely enlightened by the Holy Spirit. They were genuine. They were holy men of God. They were saints. Like the fathers they weren't just writers of the church. They were actual saints of the church that left for us guideposts, so that we don't get mixed up with all the confusion that's out there. Like we talked about before, about how we could, by trusting the fathers, we save ourselves from falling into the trap of continuously, every 4 years, every time a new war starts up. Oh, that's Gog and Magog, so we can save
Right.
ourselves that confusion, that mental anguish, from living on the edge about what Bible prophecy is going to be fulfilled next.
Right.
When we lean on the writings of the fathers, and trust their guidance, their spirit, not just their historical or spiritual writings, but their moral teachings, and their what they left for us to guide us in the spiritual life, is that helps us to wade through all the waters that are out there in this turbulent times
Yeah.
that we live in, that we've always lived in. Really, it's always been turbulent times. I think that's one thing we could take away from today's talk, is that even though we see all these nations coming against each other in the modern times, but like what we talked about, I think what the viewers could tell is that it's always been this way, you know, to a
Mhm.
greater or lesser extent. You had, I mean, just think if we were living in the 12th century with the Mongol invasions. It's like that was
Yeah.
something else.
The
So I
fall of
mean,
Constantinople.
that too, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So all throughout history, there's been these epic events that have led people to basically go to the Bible and maybe think that, is this the fulfillment of Scripture? And like what we could finalize is, like, just like Father Athanasios talked about, the cyclical theory of the seals being loosed and then playing out and then coming back and then resealing themselves, is that this could be the revelation could not just be talking about the 7 year tribulation, but all of the recorded history of mankind
Mm.
playing out itself throughout and talked and spoken or written about in a cryptic fashion. to where it's not it's like these mysteries. Well, people will realize that the mysteries of the Christian mysteries, they reveal and they conceal at the same time.
Mm.
It becomes a very mystical. It became That's what people have to understand is that Orthodox Christianity is mysticism. It is mystical. It is a mystical tradition of the church is a mystical tradition. And when we say that word mystical, don't get all worried like it's black magic or something. It's not. That's what a lot of people associate mysticism with nowadays. But true mysticism is found in Christianity, and it's a safe mysticism because you can't go wrong because it's instituted by Christ himself. He's the head of
Mhm.
the church. He's sent the gift of the Holy Spirit upon his apostles. They laid their hands upon their disciples, and they carry this tradition that's extended since the time of Christ up until now. Like Christ said, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against my church. And
Yeah.
so this ascetical mystical tradition has continued, and I think we can trust the church fathers and
And
trust the
it's
mysticism of.
mystical
Uh-huh.
because God is mysterious.
Well, there
We
you go. I
can't.
mean, like, what do we even life itself is a mystery.
Mhm.
Even if you're non even someone who's really could be non-religious, they themselves. I mean, how many people say, "What's the meaning of life?" Like the cliche. But really, that's the fact that people are questioning that may not even be from a religious background. The fact that people are saying, what does this life mean?" That lets you know that life, even without cracking up on a Bible, lets you know that the life that we live in, this human experience that we're having in this universe, in this life that we live, is a mystery.
Mhm.
Life is a mystery, and God Himself is the relationship between humans and God is a mystery. You know,
Right.
and it even says in Revelation at the end when it says when Christ comes, it says, then the final mystery of God will be revealed
Mm.
at the very end. Right. But we're
Closing
not
the
there yet.
book. Yeah.
Yeah, the end.
The end.
But that's just it. That's one thing that Christians have to look forward to. As for Christians, the end is just the beginning. The end is just the beginning, and the kingdom has come, and the kingdom come.
Of course. Well,
Hmm.
thank you, Dionysius, for joining me today. Appreciate everyone for watching. If you found this topic interesting, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have some suggestions for future episodes, future topics, also let us know in the comments. This has been Old Testament Mysteries with the Body Ascetic and the Leap of Faith. I'll see you next time.